I have a really cool quilt for you today, and it's this quilt. So this quilt, my mom and dad purchased for me at a thrift shop. They are always on the lookout for old quilts for me. They found this one and it's the coolest. But before I share this quilt with you and before we take a closer look, my name is Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Lessons from an Old Quilt. And I'm calling this one the signature quilt. So this quilt measures 52 by 79.5 inches. It is a album quilt or a signature quilt or an autograph quilt or a friendship quilt. There's so many different names given to this type of quilt. I believe it's dated around 1930, 1940, and it is a awesome quilt. So let's take a closer look and talk a little bit more about this type of quilt and possibly what happened with this quilt. Okay, so you can pretty much see the block. I don't think I really need to point it out to you. It is 6 by 6 or 6.5 by 6.5 unfinished, and they're all set on this diagonal, but they are, the whole setting itself is on the straight way. So we see the squares one after another. So this block is unique in that the center is meant for the signature of the people that would be participating. And that could be for somebody who was going away, maybe traveling, maybe moving, anything you can think of basically. It could be an event like a special anniversary, a special birthday, something like that. And there's just many reasons that these were made. They were often made to commemorate something, and sometimes they were even made as a fundraiser. So they would make the blocks, sell a block space and make some money and then even raffle off the quilt. So there's so much history about this, and I'll put some links in the description to give you some resources if you want to read up more on this. A lot of times the signatures were embroidered on, so the signature would be written and then somebody would embroider over it. Now, what I find interesting about this quilt is there are no signatures, and trust me, I have just looked so closely to see if they were faded or anything like that in these blocks. I can't see any evidence of a signature on any of them. That makes me wonder, was this quilt made and then they were going to be signed and it just never happened? Or were the signatures done in ink that washed away? I don't know. Or was this put together later? There's so many questions I have about this, and I would love to know the answer. But let's talk about the fabrics in this. Now, each block has a partner for the most part. There's a few that are strays that don't have one that's identical to it, but for the most part there are two of each, and you can see that here and here. Usually they're not this close together. Let me move this over. Usually they're not this close together. There's a few instances where that happened, but they are randomly placed around this quilt, which there was a lot of intention put to it. What I really love about this design in general, other than it's a signature quilt, is you do get a secondary pattern. Let me see if I can get a good example of that here. So you see an hourglass block here where they come together, and that's really cool too. The fabrics are interesting. So we have this wonderful purple that might be like from the 40s. So that might be a bit of a later print. We also have the 1930s prints that we all kind of know and love because there's so many reproduction fabrics of it. I always have to point out though, the placement of the geometric designs. I love this, that there was a lot of thought put into keeping these lines straight and keeping the plaid straight and all of that. I think that really adds to it, and I love that detail. So like I said, it is machine pieced and it is machine quilted, and it's simply done in a grid pattern. So there's nothing necessarily special about that, but it still held it together well. And there is some holes and some damage that I am going to repair. I have not washed this yet. I'm hoping to get some of these stains out, like this one here. There's some stain in the middle, and there's just some yucky, grungy stuff on it. So I want to wash it, but before I wash it, of course, I'm going to secure the seams where there are holes, because I don't want it to fall apart. Another thing I want to talk about are blocks like this one. And you can see there's not a lot of contrast between the background and the actual print. And we see that a few places, like this one and this one. It has a really cool print, but it is blending in. It's just something to think about when you're making a quilt. I think it adds interest to this, but it might be something you want to consider if you're going to be making a signature quilt. Okay, so let's look at the back. So there are a few seams. It looks like that the back was made in 4 quadrants and they are seamed together on the back, but you can hardly tell it because there is so much busyness on this fabric, so it really blends in well. The fabric itself is really cute. It has like almost like picture frames or something with little flowers in them. I love that. So the thread used for quilting is just a white thread and it really blends in. It's hard to see the quilting pattern on the back like we see in some of them, but hey, that's okay too. So let's talk about the binding. So at first glance, I thought that the binding was wrapped around and it was part of the backing, but it's not. It's actually sewn on separately. And what's really unique about it, what I really love, is that the maker made miter corners on all of the corners except for one, which is right here. So you can see, let me hold them up against each other. You can see a mitered corner on this one, but this one was just folded over and finished this way. And I'll try to get a good inset picture of this because there's no joining of the binding that we see usually. This is a totally different way of binding. And I didn't notice this until I was really studying the quilt. So I think that's really cool. I mean, there's so many different ways to do things as we've seen on all of these quilts. And I love that. It's really nice when you have a binding that matches the backing because it helps blend in any mistakes that you might have, and especially if you're new. Now it was hand tacked down after it was placed on. So the batting inside is just a super thin cotton batting. I can see it by peeking in one of the holes like I usually do. And I just love it. I am gonna repair the holes, get it into the wash and see if I can get some of these stains out. So I think it's the coolest quilt. As you can tell, this is a favorite of mine. I just love it. So let's talk about some of the lessons we can learn from this quilt. So like I said, I don't know what happened to the signatures. Were they on there and they washed off? Were they never on there? Were they intended to be signed after the quilt was made? I don't know. But when you're thinking about making a signature quilt or friendship quilt, you know, make sure you keep in mind that inks can fade, okay? And a good example of this is even the micron pens. I've had them fade on me to the point that I can't read what I wrote on my labels. So make sure that you use a really good permanent pen or even embroider the names on them because they do fade and sometimes they wash completely away, which may have happened in this quilt. Next, consider using the same binding as your backing, especially if you're new to putting binding on. This will hide many errors and it will just give a consistency to your quilt. It will look really neat just like this one and give you a little bit of ease of construction as well. So just a thought, something to consider. Next, let's continue to talk about binding. There is more than one way to bind a quilt. We know that, and you can see this is a very unique binding method. I love that. I think that it was ingenious of this maker to do it this way. Maybe the maker didn't know how to join binding. Maybe he or she did not know how to finish it. Who knows? But it is a really neat way to do it, and it's something I didn't even notice until I started looking at it closely. I hope you enjoyed looking at this quilt with me. It's definitely a favorite of mine. I love the colors, I love the fabrics, I love everything about it. I don't know what I'll do with it. I've actually thought about having some of my friends sign it because I think that would be really cool too, and keep it as a signature quilt. But I don't know, we'll see. Have a great day. I hope you take some time to sew. Please consider subscribing if you haven't done so, and I'll see you soon. Bye.